2023 by 9,324,901,764 in respect of the votes contained in the first schedule. 4. Resolves that the new first schedule forms the basis for the introduction of the Supplementary Appropriations Bill 2023, and further, that is number 5, makes the policy resolutions contained in the second schedule to the order paper. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honorable members, although that notice has been given, I have permitted the chair to move the motion at the time it will be moved in an amended form under Standing Order 48. So take notice of that. Next order.
Order number 7, questions and statements.
Is there any? Honorable members, I wish to acknowledge the following schools in the public gallery: Mwiki Primary School from Ruiru, Kiambu; Kigumo Bendera High School from Kigumo, Murang'a. On my behalf and your behalf, I wish to welcome the two schools to the House of Parliament. Thank you. Next.
Order number 8, motion, report on the first supplementary estimates for the financial year 2022-2023.
Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I beg to move this motion in amended form pursuant to Standing Order 48 to also incorporate some of the variations that you approved earlier as follows: that the House adopts the report of the Budget and Appropriations Committee on the first supplementary estimates for the financial year 2022-2023 laid on the table of the House on Tuesday, February 28.
Honorable Ndindi Nyoro, I will give you permission to use the dispatch box for your submission if it will make you more comfortable.
I'm okay here.
You're okay where you are?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I continue that this House adopts the report of the Budget and Appropriations Committee on the first supplementary estimates for this current financial year 2022-2023 laid on the table of the House on Tuesday, February 28, 2023, and pursuant to provisions of Article 223 of the Constitution and Standing Order 243. Number 1, approves an increment of the total recurrent expenditure for the financial year 2022-2023 by Kenya shillings 93,521,939,535 in respect of the votes contained in the first schedule. 2, approves a reduction of the total capital expenditure for financial year 2022-2023 by Kenya shillings 84,197,037,771 in respect of the votes contained in the first schedule. 3, approves an overall increment in the total budget for financial year 2022-2023 by Kenya shillings 9,324,901,764 in respect of the votes contained in the first schedule. 4, resolves that the first schedule forms the basis for the introduction of the Supplementary Appropriations Bill 2023 and further makes the policy resolution contained in the second schedule to the paper subject to Mr. Speaker, adjustments to the various votes like 1071, 1169, 1311, 1166, 1109, 1066, and others that have already been approved by you, Mr. Speaker. I beg to move. Mr. Speaker, we have been in this process of considering the supplementary estimates, and just for a brief to the members, for us to be on the same page in regards to the business of the day, Mr. Speaker, majority or all our departmental committees had sessions with the various MDAs that they oversight. And Mr. Speaker, the Budget and Appropriations Committee took time with the departmental committee chairs who brought forth, Mr. Speaker, the recommendations from the various MDAs. We have been able to thoroughly and meticulously consider all the requests from the various departmental chairs. And Mr. Speaker, just for a brief, Mr. Speaker, some people may ask the reason for a supplementary budget, not just for this financial year, but because we have various other, also supplementary budgets which have been passed, and for sure we'll be considering many others going forward. Mr. Speaker, in this current year, and especially the financial year, we have had change in government, Mr. Speaker, and every new administration comes with their own agenda, Mr. Speaker, and manifesto. And therefore it was important that we recheck on our budget, which is already printed, so that we can align, Mr. Speaker, the issues that the current administration would wish to accomplish in line with the promises made to Kenyans. Mr. Speaker, when we talk about money, when we talk about budgeting, fortunately or unfortunately, the focus is usually on the expenditure side. But Mr. Speaker, when we are considering budget making, just for members so that we're on the same page, we consider two areas. One is the supply side of money, which is headed by the very able chair, Honorable Kemani Kuria, in the Finance Committee. And then there is the expenditure side that we consider and we handle as the Budget and Appropriations Committee. These two areas are critical because, Mr. Speaker, the monies that we seek to expend, the monies that we actually allocate to various programs, this money comes from somewhere. And majority of this money, Mr. Speaker, as majority of the members know, it comes from the ordinary revenue. Just to give a snapshot for the members to know the kind of situations we have been considering this supplementary budget on, Mr. Speaker, the current budget that is there, the printed budget, was a budget of around 3.3 trillion Kenya shillings. And Mr. Speaker, on that budget, we had allocated, or we had foreseen that we will be able to collect ordinary revenues to a tune of 2.16 trillion Kenya shillings. Mr. Speaker, we expected grants of around that 3 billion Kenya shillings. And also, Mr. Speaker, we had anticipated A, which is appropriations in aid, to a tune of just around 300 billion. In addition to that, Mr. Speaker, you see that for a budget of 3.3 trillion Kenya shillings to be financed, there is a hole that we call, in other terms, a deficit of just approximately 860 billion Kenya shillings. Mr. Speaker, this is money that we budget to use. This is money that we budget on the expenditure side, but this money is not available. And therefore, what we put in as the budget, Mr. Speaker, what we call the deficit, is the money that we anticipate to borrow. That is both locally and also which is domestic borrowing, and also in terms of foreign borrowing. Mr. Speaker, on the expenditure side also, out of the 3.3 trillion Kenya shillings, Mr. Speaker, we had also anticipated various rise in terms of expenditure. And Mr. Speaker, our salaries as a country is shy of 900 billion Kenya shillings. Mr. Speaker, there is another vote we call recurrent non-salary. That is when we are in offices and we are making good use of those offices by extending service to the Kenyan people. There is also other facilitation which is recurrent in nature, like transportation, like the other travel, like training, and the other, Mr. Speaker, areas that we expect money to be able to serve Kenyans. And when I say we, I don't just mean the members of parliament, but the entirety of the people who actually are in public service. Mr. Speaker, therefore, that is around 1.4 billion Kenya shillings. Of that money also, for proper delivery. Or members, you are fine with us here?
You can go to the dispatch box.
Want to look at you in the eye.
Proceed, Honorable Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I think this is better for proper interaction with members. Mr. Speaker, the current budget as printed is around 3.3 trillion Kenya shillings. I just enumerated the side of the revenue side, Mr. Speaker. And I was in the process of enumerating the side of I enumerated the revenue side. Mr. Speaker, on the expenditure side, the amount of money we pay in terms of salaries in this country is just shy of 900 billion Kenya shillings. Mr. Speaker, on top of the salaries, which is almost sacrosanct in terms of you cannot debate around what to do with the salaries other than pay, there is also another recurrent expenditure, Mr. Speaker, that is recurrent non-salary. This is money, Mr. Speaker, that we facilitate the civil servants in terms of delivering the service to the Kenyan people. Mr. Speaker, that is around 600 or thereabout billion Kenya shillings. On top of that, Mr. Speaker, there is another term we call CFS. CFS is consolidated, is the fund that actually takes care of payments of interest rates and servicing of loans, and also in terms of commissions, because we treat commissions as additional governments, and therefore any administration cannot handicap any commission. The monies for commissions are also put as a first charge within CFS, which is just around also 860 billion Kenya shillings. Mr. Speaker, we have also grants to our counties, which in this current financial year, we are talking about 300 billion Kenya shillings. Mr. Speaker, during that month, clearly, as the leadership of this country, we have an obligation to think deep and to think wide in regards on how to make our budgets. Because perpetually, Mr. Speaker, we cannot continue making a deficit budget, Mr. Speaker, and especially that which enlarges the deficit every passing year. Mr. Speaker, that is what informed the President that and of course, the Treasury and ourselves, that we needed to come up with a formula where we are going to cut on the deficit, Mr. Speaker, and also in terms of the kind of borrowing that we do in this country. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, that is the situation that led to the famous 300 billion cuts, Mr. Speaker, that was foreseeing on reducing the fiscal deficit in our country, Mr. Speaker, so that we do not descend into an abyss of financial misprudence. Mr. Speaker, I want to first of all address this issue of borrowing, because it is the issue that informed the reduction of the 300 billion Kenya shillings. Majority of us argue, and we have had treasuries there before, the officials arguing, that majority of the economies actually borrow money. And therefore, it is not an entirely bad thing to borrow. Mr. Speaker, I agree and disagree on the same matter. Number one, Mr. Speaker, borrowing is good. Every country borrows. The US, actually, in terms of GDP debt to GDP ratio, some of the countries that we seek to be like, economies like the US, when in Kenya we are talking about 70 to 80% debt to GDP ratio. Mr. Speaker, an economy like the US is actually in excess of 100%. A country like the UK is also in excess of 110% debt to GDP ratio. Mr. Speaker, a country like Japan has actually is now the front runner, is now the outlier in that field, because it has borrowed in excess of 250% debt to GDP ratio. But Mr. Speaker, comparing our country Kenya with those economies that I have enumerated, with the kind of conditions that we are facing, Mr. Speaker, I feel this is like comparing a camel and an apple. Mr. Speaker, there is nothing to compare. And on the first front, when you talk about borrowing, the first thing you consider is the cost. The current cost of borrowing in Kenya, the last 10-year board, Mr. Speaker, to the last data that I saw, was just around 13.6% exempt of tax. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, having that kind of interest rate in terms of cost of borrowing is not sustainable. And I'm saying that comparative. A country like Japan, Mr. Speaker, when you track the 10-year borrowing of the Japanese government, Mr. Speaker, you realize that in some years, they have been able to raise money on negative interest rates. Mr. Speaker, what do I mean? That at some point in the last 10 years, the Japanese government has actually borrowed on negative rates. And therefore, on that front, Mr. Speaker, there is no way we can consider Kenya or compare Kenya with those kind of economies, Mr. Speaker. On the second front is the usage. Some of these countries strictly borrow for development. But Mr. Speaker, using the tabulations that I gave earlier, you will be able to realize, Mr. Speaker, that majority of the money that we borrow is not expended insofar as even the spirit of the Constitution would provide. That we should borrow money that strictly goes into investments, what we call development. Mr. Speaker, some of the monies we have been borrowing, this is the money, some of it that has been going into recurrent expenditure. And Mr. Speaker, there is no economy across the world that is prudent that should be encouraging borrowing that goes into recurrent. Mr. Speaker, there is another area that I implore upon my colleagues to also consider, and I am sure we have a committee in this House strictly that deals with borrowing, that is debt and privatization. Mr. Speaker, there is another term in borrowing called netting off. Netting off, Mr. Speaker, is that an economy like Kenya, Mr. Speaker, we are net borrowers. Not just net borrowers, we are gross borrowers. Mr. Speaker, there is no economy in the world that Kenya lends money to. And therefore, when we report debt to GDP ratio, we are reporting both gross and net in terms of our borrowing. But Mr. Speaker, using the same examples that I gave, and especially citing Japan, Japan is a country that is indebted, that is fine, but on very low interest rate. But Mr. Speaker, another consideration we must make is that as Japan reports the debt to GDP ratio of 250%, Japan is also a huge creditor of the world, Mr. Speaker. The US economy, Mr. Speaker, the highest creditor to the US is actually the Japanese government. And Mr. Speaker, therefore, when we consider borrowing, it is imprudent for us to compare our country to economies that are advanced as the ones that have tabulated there before. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, these are the issues that the Committee on the Budget and Appropriations considered while undertaking the cuts and the other realignments, Mr. Speaker, that I'll be enumerating as we continue. Mr. Speaker, as the period where we consider these supplementary estimates, what are the kind of conditions that we were relying on in terms of the conditions within our economy and the circumstances in our country? Mr. Speaker, allow me just a minute, first of all, because Kenya is, we talk about the domestic economy, but Kenya, Mr. Speaker, is also in a global economy. It is intertwined in whatever happens elsewhere. Mr. Speaker, what are the conditions of the global economy? And I'll cite just a few, Mr. Speaker, that especially correspond with our conditions back here at home. Mr. Speaker, one of the conditions, of course, that we know very well is that the supply chains across the world, and in regards to food, Mr. Speaker, have been hampered by some of the issues, and especially man-made, that has been happening in the last many months across the world. And especially, Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, one of the conditions is the war that is ongoing in Europe, Mr. Speaker, and therefore, for us to understand even how this is affecting even our plate, or the plate of the Kenyan people. Number one, Mr. Speaker, previous to the war, Ukraine and Russia accounted for around 30% of the world's corn export. Mr. Speaker, both countries accounted for 20 to 30% of the world's wheat export. Mr. Speaker, there is another mind-boggling figure that both countries, Mr. Speaker, before the war, they accounted for over 70% of sunflower oil, Mr. Speaker, and sunflower food exports across the world. Mr. Speaker, when you disrupt that kind of supply chain, it boomerangs even to our economy like Kenya. And some of the conditions that you are facing, Mr. Speaker, are premised on those kind of conditions. Mr. Speaker, an economy like the US, because there has been a situation of global inflation, which has hit, yes, Kenya, but it has hit also other global economies. After the COVID checks that we are given by the US government, Mr. Speaker, that increased the amount of money available, disposable income, to the citizens of the US. Mr. Speaker, that created a room of inflation when the same people, Mr. Speaker, demanded for the same commodities, and therefore, Mr. Speaker, driving the price upwards. What the Fed did, Mr. Speaker, to arrest that, and Fed is our equivalent of central bank. What the Fed did, Mr. Speaker, is that for the last 1 year to date, the Fed has had to raise interest rates 7 unprecedented times, Mr. Speaker. When you raised interest rates in terms of Fed raising interest rates, Mr. Speaker, to arrest the issue of inflation, that also cuts the other way, because every action economically is a double-edged sword, Mr. Speaker. As they tried to arrest inflation using the rise in terms of interest rates, Mr. Speaker, this also had another ramification to other smaller economies like ours, because majority of the investors, majority of the people who invest, even in a country like ours, found US in terms of the fixed investments being more preferred than countries like ours, Mr. Speaker, given investments in the US, Mr. Speaker, is dollar denominated, and therefore whatever you gain has no net off in terms of currency devaluation. Mr. Speaker, therefore, that is why we are seeing even our own Nairobi Securities Exchange performing poorly, because some of the counters like Safaricom, which ordinarily are driven by foreigners, foreign investors, they now have better options, Mr. Speaker, and especially by investing in fixed investments in areas like the US. And Mr. Speaker, also, we have seen the devaluation of our local currency, but Mr. Speaker, without justifying, this is not just happening to Kenya shilling. Every other currency across the world has weakened against the dollar, including the euro, including the pound, Mr. Speaker, because of the reason that I gave earlier, that then the majority of investors are trooping in the US, Mr. Speaker, where there are better rates in terms of fixed income, and therefore they consider that because there is no issue of currency change. Mr. Speaker, I now wish to go to the specifics. On the specifics, Mr. Speaker, as we consider these supplementary estimates, we are considering one animal called Article 223. Mr. Speaker, Article 223 permits the Treasury to expend money to a tune of 10%, Mr. Speaker, and therefore, afterwards, they regularize through bringing those expenditures to Parliament. Mr. Speaker, what we have seen as the Budget and Appropriations Committee, and I am also sure that the other departmental committees also are aware of this issue, is that, Mr. Speaker, we need more stringent regulations around Article 223. Because, Mr. Speaker, the spirit of Article 223 is issues that are unforeseen, issues that are not priorly budgeted in terms of enough budget. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, also, the same Article 223 disqualifies new projects. But what we have seen in the past, Mr. Speaker, is that there has been blatant abuse of Article 223. And I suppose, and we made this recommendation, Mr. Speaker, to this House, that we tighten Article 223, that Article 223 should only come in to save the country during a rainy day. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, we will be recommending to this House various recommendations.
Yes, Honorable Melamba. Can you give the Honorable Melamba? Under what standing orders your intervention?
Honorable Speaker, I rise on a motion of privilege, which is a budget matter that something is producing sound that we are not sure of. And therefore, that may need to be addressed as we know this is going to move.
On the budget, on supplementary budget by the chair of the budget committee, we are really enjoying, but there's some disturbance that possibly you could call the leadership to take care of. Thank you, Honorable Speaker.
Sergeant, make sure the Honorable Melamba is not apprehensive.
Even Honorable Nyoro himself.
Ndindi endelea.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I was talking about Article 223, Mr. Speaker, and we feel that we need to tighten on how Treasury can make use of this Article 223. Mr. Speaker, we considered several of them, but in the considered opinion of the departmental committees responsible and the Budget and Appropriations Committee, Mr. Speaker, we considered and passed all the Article 223 expenditure except two, Mr. Speaker. One is in terms of payment to Telecom Kenya, that was around 6 billion Kenya shillings, and the second one was in regards to UGA subsidy, Mr. Speaker, which was around 4 billion Kenya shillings. Mr. Speaker, this was not purely our recommendation as Budget and Appropriations Committee. Mr. Speaker, we actually took up the recommendation of the departmental committees, Mr. Speaker, and upon perusal to find extra details, since they were not forthcoming, Mr. Speaker, we passed all the rest except the rejection of the two. Mr. Speaker, just allow me, even if I had considered the circumstances under which these supplementary estimates were considered, I request that you permit me to address one matter, Mr. Speaker, which is very close to the members of this House. When the cost of living goes up, when inflation goes up, it directly affects the people that we represent. And Mr. Speaker, partly there has been many issues that have brought about the kind of inflation we are having, and especially in the food basket. Mr. Speaker, I earlier talked about the supply chain disruptions in regards to the Ukraine and Europe issues that are happening there. But also, Mr. Speaker, our country is going through a very serious drought, Mr. Speaker, that, Mr. Speaker, we have not seen for the last 40 years. But allow me, Mr. Speaker, in a minute, for the benefit of all of us, to demonstrate, Mr. Speaker, as we consider inflation from where we sit, what we see. And Mr. Speaker, I gave this analogy in Mombasa when during our induction. Mr. Speaker, inflation is caused by two things. Number one is the monetary side, the monetary propelled inflation. And there is the physical propelled inflation. Mr. Speaker, the monetary side of inflation is the one that is caused when there is a lot of money in circulation. And just to demonstrate, Mr. Speaker, if you have a kiosk in a place maybe here in the CBD, and this kiosk sells uga, Mr. Speaker, inflation can come in when the same people who go to this kiosk have much more money and therefore go to the same shop to demand more uga. Therefore, consequently, Mr. Speaker, the owner of the kiosk takes up the price of uga because they are there to make money. So they increase their margin. That is monetarily propelled inflation. Mr. Speaker, there is the other one that is physical. And this one, Mr. Speaker, is more or less the issue of supply chain. Mr. Speaker, the same kiosk could be there, but the same customers are there. But Mr. Speaker, in a kiosk that sells maybe 20 bales of uga per day, the lorry that brings the same uga to the kiosk probably develops issues, and therefore supplies are not brought to the kiosk. And therefore the kiosk that usually have a stock of 20 bales, maybe they have 5, but the same customers remain. And therefore, because of the mismatch between demand and supply, Mr. Speaker, therefore, also the owner of the shop increases the price. Mr. Speaker, the kind of inflation we are having in this country is both-sided. But I feel, and that is what we considered as the Budget and Appropriations Committee, as the CPC considered the monetary side of inflation, it is the obligation of this House, as we make the budget, to be able to address the physical side of inflation, and that is what precisely we have done through these supplementary estimates. Mr. Speaker, we have provisioned enough money and enough resources for subsidized fertilizer and for subsidized inputs. Because, Mr. Speaker, we feel, as this House, and especially Budget Committee representing this House, that we need to increase the supplies, the kind of food supplies that we grow. And the best way to do that, Mr. Speaker, is not to come at the tail end and subsidize consumption. We thought, by the wisdom of the committee, but it is more appropriate to address the issue of inflation and the issue of supply, not on the consumption side, but on the production side. And that is why these supplementary estimates, Mr. Speaker, most of the money saved elsewhere have got into production of food, Mr. Speaker, by enabling our farmers to produce more, Mr. Speaker, by availing subsidized fertilizer, so that we also address the physical side of the food chain. Mr. Speaker, I now want to go to specific areas that we considered. Number one, I just said there before that the Budget and Appropriations Committee, Mr. Speaker, is seeking that we approve fertilizer subsidy to a tune of 15 billion Kenya shillings. Mr. Speaker, this money is already provided so that we cushion our farmers and increase on the productivity. Number two, Mr. Speaker, most of which was on 223, we have also provisioned money for the fuel subsidy. Yes, we are aware that the subsidies are no longer continuing, but Mr. Speaker, there are previous obligations in regards to the fuel subsidy. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, a government that is responsible is a government that pays bills. And therefore, we provision that money so that we pay the people who actually were involved in that fuel subsidy. Mr. Speaker, the issue of pending bills is a monumental matter. Mr. Speaker, on roads alone, the pending bills in this country is crossing the mark of 150 billion. And when I talk about pending bills, I do not want to confuse members who may be referencing on the commitments. When we talk about pending bills, these are already certified works. The commitment within the road sector alone, Mr. Speaker, is going to 1 trillion Kenya shillings because it's 930 billion Kenya shillings. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, we tried as much as possible to be able to address pending bills, but also in our recommendation, we are seeking that this House tightens the noose around pending bills. Because, Mr. Speaker, we have seen irresponsibility, especially in how we expend government money when we are coming to the close of the financial year. We cannot continue singing this song of pending bills forever. Mr. Speaker, beyond what we did as the budget committee, we will be making recommendations on how not to perpetuate the same. Mr. Speaker, on the same issue of pending bills in regards to roads, there is a fund called annuity fund, Mr. Speaker, and we are requesting that this House passes that the ministry responsible has access to these monies at the annuity fund, which is an A in A within the department, Mr. Speaker, so that the 12 billion in there can be used into settling some of the pending bills, so that the contractors can go back to site and the roads in our constituencies, Mr. Speaker, can get reprieve. Mr. Speaker, on the same matter, you realize that after the rationalization of the budget, Mr. Speaker, the Treasury had slashed substantially the budget of the roads department that percolates to the various agencies. Mr. Speaker, we are seeking that this House also approves what we saw as the right thing to do, that we have reinstated back 10 billion Kenya shillings, Mr. Speaker, that will go purposely into the payments of pending bills of the ongoing roads projects. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, we have been able to provision, through the supplementary estimates, an additional 22 billion Kenya shillings that will go into making sure that the contractors go back to site. Mr. Speaker, I want also to address one matter that is very dear to the hearts of the many members here. Members, you remember in the last financial year, some of the monies that are due for NGCDF, some of which the members had already procured, some of which the works are already done, to a tune of over 240 constituencies, still have arrears of 12 million Kenya shillings, Mr. Speaker, due to them. Mr. Speaker, through these supplementary estimates, we have provisioned 2.9 billion Kenya shillings so that constituencies can get the 12 million arrears across all of them that they are owed. Mr. Speaker, you realize also in terms of GAF, the operationalization of GAF is also handicapped in regards to the monies that are needed to be able to unlock the monies that the women representatives expect in terms of their service to the Kenyan people. Mr. Speaker, we have provisioned enough money, Mr. Speaker, to be able to operationalize GAF so that the Kenyan people can continue receiving the services that the women reps, Mr. Speaker, advance to them. Mr. Speaker, we have also tried as much as possible, whatever money that we saved, we have been able to allocate this money into issues of drought mitigation, Mr. Speaker. Drought mitigation is two-layered. Mr. Speaker, number one, for us to do the mega things of irrigation and etc., we need to do these things to people who are already alive. Mr. Speaker, therefore, we first provisioned money to keep the Kenyan people alive. And we have provisioned enough money, Mr. Speaker, through the National Drought, NDMA, and the other relevant agencies, Mr. Speaker, to be able to cater for enough relief food. Because we cannot, as a country, continue to beg for money, Mr. Speaker, when we have a provision to feed our people using the resources that are available to us. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, on the first layer, we have provided for enough money to be able to cater for the relief food, Mr. Speaker, number one, but also layer two, for the medium term to long term drought mitigation. When I talk about drought mitigation, Mr. Speaker, number one is about the storage of water, because majority of the farming that we do, Mr. Speaker, we rely primarily on rain-fed agriculture. Mr. Speaker, we cannot continue to put our country and especially our food basket and our food security to the vagaries of the weather. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, whatever savings that we got, we made sure that this money is going into agencies that we have tasked as this House to be able to deal with irrigation matters and other areas around drought mitigation. And in that regard, Mr. Speaker, I want to implore upon this House, there is a critical decision that we have to make. there are bodies in Kenya called RDAs. These are regional development authorities. And we know them, they serve our areas. Mr. Speaker, when these bodies were conceptualized, we didn't have devolution. Mr. Speaker, also, we did have waterworks agencies. Mr. Speaker, we saw something that is mind-boggling. Some of these RDAs, regional development authorities, like the Lake Basin, like Tarda, like those are the kind of institutions I'm talking about. Like Nyoro, there is a development body over there. Mr. Speaker, you find an agency with recurrent expenditure of 240 million, but their development expenditure is only 20 million a year. Mr. Speaker, we cannot continue to make these kind of mistakes in regards to making our budget. We have to make a radical decision as a country that we cannot continue having institutions gobbling 300 million in terms of annual recurrent expenditure, and then this house appropriates or gives them 20 million for development. Mr. Speaker, we need to ask hard questions. Either we give them enough money to be able to offer service to the Kenyan people, or we hold them, Mr. Speaker, and merge their whatever they do, Mr. Speaker, to other relevant agencies. But there is no way we will continue to have RDAs, which has recurrent expenditure of 240 million, with a development expenditure of 20 million. It doesn't make sense to us, and I'm sure it doesn't make sense to this House either. Mr. Speaker, we have done several other things. Number one, Mr. Speaker, you know we have a policy of instituting a TVET per constituency. Majority of our constituencies, including Kiharu, we have been able to benefit through this program, and we have TVETs that are in various in various levels. Some are starting, some are operational. But Mr. Speaker, there are over 50 constituencies that do not have TVETs yet. And how this TVET issue works is that the CDF allocates 10 million shillings. And then the government, through the relevant department, they provision around 40 million. We build a TVET. Then the government itself, through the relevant department, they also stock the relevant equipment in those TVETs. Mr. Speaker, through these supplementary estimates, we have been able to provision enough money, Mr. Speaker, for the constituencies that do not have TVETs to also have an opportunity, Mr. Speaker, to have those TVETs. Mr. Speaker, some of the late amendments that we did, one of them is looking into a very important area, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, through the Ministry of Education, 1.9 million school-going children, Mr. Speaker, will not have an opportunity to access education, Mr. Speaker, given the conditions of their homes and the conditions of the areas that they are growing up in. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, there is a project through the Ministry of Education that provisions lunch to over 1.9 million school-going primary children, Mr. Speaker, some of who are in ASAL areas. Mr. Speaker, we have been able to provision enough money for up to second term for us to give uninterrupted service to these vulnerable children, Mr. Speaker, that they also get food when they go to school, Mr. Speaker, so that even as we offer quality education, these young ones need to be in schools in the first place. Mr. Speaker, I am sure members will peruse our report, which we have outlined many issues. But among the ones that I want to wind up with is the housing program. Mr. Speaker, you know, this administration is very keen on delivering affordable housing to the Kenyan people. But this has been happening primarily in extremely urban areas. The semi-urban and small town areas, Mr. Speaker, have not been able to benefit from the housing program. Mr. Speaker, in consultation with the relevant departmental committee, through these supplementary estimates, we have been able to provision a seed capital of 1 billion Kenya shillings, Mr. Speaker, that we are going to have housing program running across all our 290 constituencies. Mr. Speaker, this has been informed by the fact that if you are able to tabulate where the housing program has been happening, it's primarily in Nairobi and other very big cities. Mr. Speaker, we also need to take this service to where the bulk of the people of Kenya live, because 70% of the Kenyan people actually live in rural areas. And therefore, it is good to focus on the towns that are nearer the rural areas, Mr. Speaker, because the residents of those areas are also in need of affordable houses, Mr. Speaker. And we have been able to anchor this very properly, that this money is seed capital for us to roll out this program across all our constituencies, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there is much that we can say, but I do not wish to consume all the time there is, so that we can also have other members contribute to this very important motion. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, I suppose, because the report is available, members will go through the recommendations. I have not belabored by going through all of them. They are there. I have not belabored by going through the observations, Mr. Speaker, because of the fact that members already have this report, and I am sure they are already interacting with it. Mr. Speaker, some may question, for example, why they may not see the issues, for example, around ICT. Mr. Speaker, some of the programs that we are undertaking, and especially the
Chairman,
issue...
you have 5 minutes to end up.
Thank you very much. The issue of fiber optic across all our areas. Mr. Speaker, I want to volunteer this information to members that there is the service fund through the CA, which has got enough money to be able to, for that money, and that money is available to be expended in regards to the ICT issues that we want to deliver to the Kenyan people. Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the members of the Budget and Appropriations Committee. I also wish to thank the members of all the departmental committees who took time through to listen to the various MDAs. And Mr. Speaker, I want to give the comfort to all the departmental committees that to the level where the departmental committee gave a recommendation to the budget committee on zero sum. And I want members to listen to this very carefully, because majority of us are also in departmental committee. The Budget and Appropriations Committee gives a lot of respect and accords a lot of respect to various departmental committees. And therefore, up to the point where you did rearrangements and you gave us a zero-sum recommendation, up to 97% or even 100% of those recommendations, we carried them as the departmental committees wished. We didn't amend majority of it because we also relied on the wisdom of the various departmental committees and the decisions that they made. Where there was a slight challenge is on the addition of funding, because we are dealing with a very compressed physical space, Mr. Speaker, and I am sure even as we consider BPS, we will be able to consider all the other items that never got a chance to be considered through the limited space that we had. But I also want to bring good news to the members here that through these supplementary estimates, we have been able to condense our appetite and our physical deficit, Mr. Speaker. Our physical deficit, just to repeat, is 5.7% of our GDP. This is much lower than what was there in the printed estimates, Mr. Speaker, because we have embarked on the journey of reducing our physical deficit so that we can live within our means. I thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I move.
Who is seconding you?
Mr. Speaker, I'll call upon the Vice Chair of the Budget and Appropriations Committee, Honorable Mary Emase, to second.
Honorable Emase, before you second, allow me to acknowledge in the Speaker's gallery the presence of Kangema High School from Kangema, Muranga. On your behalf and on my own behalf, I welcome the school to the House of Parliament. Mary Emase. Give her the microphone. There you are.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for the opportunity. From the onset, I want to support the report of the Budget and Appropriations Committee. Mr. Speaker, the supplementary budget